we see that Africans actually do not see that China and the US, for example, sit in a zero-sum game kind of relationship. They don't see that if an African state chooses, or an African even respondent to these surveys thinks that China provides a good development model, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are pro-authoritarianism, or that they are pro or anti-democratic norms, or that they are anti-US. What I tried to show in the piece, that these things are so much more complicated than simplistic generalizations and simplistic narratives, that if an African state favors China, it means the US has lost. Or if an African state or an African respondent thinks highly or positively of China, then there's democratic backsliding.
And we heard it yesterday in one of our discussions, where there's this implicit assumption that the United States is benevolent, Europe is benevolent, Africa is the victim, and China is malign. And that word malign is used a lot in Washington. And these are these very simple binary narratives.
I think China also similarly sees itself as the good guy, right? China frames its development cooperation as a developing country. It's been very resistant to joining the rich world club of the OECD DAC and taking on this mantle of being a donor. It still sees itself as global South country, providing South-South cooperation and bringing its own experience and its own domestic sort of proven experience of having gone through this economic boom as a kind of marker of legitimacy when it's going out and engaging with other developing countries.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, today coming to you from a subterranean Airbnb in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, who is also here with me in Washington. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, we've been here all week meeting with various stakeholders in government, in academia, the think tanks and whatnot, having the chance to kind of do a listening tour, if you will, on the sentiment here about China and the Global South, and specifically China in Africa. There's been a lot of talk about narratives, and this is this idea of people trying to figure out what are the current trends as they relate to Chinese engagement particularly in Africa. You've had a chance to sit in on a number of those conversations. Maybe just kind of share your general assessment of what things have been said.
Well, it's kind of in a way a tough ask because it's like a fire hose of ideas. So it's really interesting to engage on these conversations. It's also a wild time to be in Washington because there's the controversy around President Biden. There's an entire NATO summit. It's a full Washington experience. So the feeling I got in speaking to many of these stakeholders is that everything feels a little bit up in the air at the moment. Kind of like people are, well, if this happens, for example, in the election in November, if this happens, then this and this and this. If that happens, then that and that and that. So it's a moment where it really feels that a lot of things are undecided. And a bunch of upcoming events, not only the election, but for example, the FOCAC summit that will happen between China and Africa in September, will determine a lot of how we understand the relationship going forward. So it's a little bit of a feeling that a lot of how we understand the relationship up to now is somewhat in suspension, and how the story is going to shake out is still being decided.
And there's a lot of questions about what China's role in Africa is, especially in this new era where they're not lending as much money. There's fewer people-to-people exchanges. The relationship has changed. And I think a lot of the questions that we're getting from folks here in Washington is, again, what is the framing? What is the shape of this new relationship? What's been your reaction to those questions?
In the first place, I think in Washington, or several Washington stakeholders seem to assume that the China-Africa relationship is just simply declining, that there's just going to be less of it. That I tend to question simply, kind of just from drawing, for example, on the Belt and Road Forum from late last year, where there seems to be the preparation set for new kinds of engagement rather than just a withdrawal. But at the same time, I think a lot of the conversation ends up being about almost kind of happening on a meta level, because there are such embedded kind of ideas of what constitutes the China-Africa relationship, among other things, for example, predatory lending, that one then ends up kind of like having to talk about the talking about China-Africa relations. There's a form of meta commentary where one has to kind of point out like, oh, okay, this is a story that people are telling about China-Africa relations. This is how it differs according to different kinds of data, for example. And then one has to kind of then do the work of seeing what kind of story the data actually tells.
Well, a lot of the people that we're speaking to here in Washington would no doubt benefit from reading a new report that came out earlier this year, exploring the role of narratives in China-Africa relations. This was a project that was born from a conference that you went to, Cobus. I think it was back in Germany. And the title of the conference was From the Workshop of the World to Systemic Rival, International Perspectives on Global China. And it was written by you, Cobus, along with 3 other China-Africa experts, all-stars in the field, if you will, and it was convened by Dr. Folashadé Soulé, who's a senior research associate at the Global Economic Governance Program at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. We've had Folashadé on the show many times. Also, Lina Benabdalla, who's an associate professor for politics and international relations at Wake Forest University. Yunnan Chen, who's a research fellow at ODI's Development and Public Finance Program in London. And Yu-Shan Wu, research fellow in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria. We are thrilled today to have Lina, Yunnan, and Yu-Shan join us today from various parts of the world to talk about this fascinating new report. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you.
Hello. Good morning. It's wonderful to be back on here.
Yes, wonderful to have you all back on the show. Again, you have all been friends of ours for a very long time, so it's great to bring you together to talk about this question of narrative. Cobus, just before we dive into what Lina, Yunnan, and Yu-Shan wrote in this fascinating report, I think it's worthwhile just explaining what the word narrative means, because in an academic context, you guys use this word a lot, but it's not necessarily well understood outside of academia. Very briefly, can you help us understand what narrative is?
Well, this is an evolving field, and I'd love to hear, kind of what everyone else also thinks about it. But, the way I approach it is that it's a form of making oneself understood, but happening in the context of very large power politics. For example, the United States is a very, very complicated entity, kind of made up of, of many different flows of capital, many different power bases, many different stakeholders. But yet we understand the United States as a certain set of ideas. And those ideas are frequently then cited by United States government stakeholders, for example, and other stakeholders, to not only justify their cooperation with external actors, but also to say what they are like and to say what they're not like. So for example, the talking point that's been coming out of the Biden administration, that the United States is about being the leader of team democracy, for example, and stands against autocracies, and autocracies being kind of a set, a defined group of particular countries. That would be an example of a narrative in which the kind of almost impossible complexity of the real kind of engagement of the United States in the world is kind of flattened and condensed into a set of stories, essentially, one that is then used strategically. I think the issue here is that these aren't just stories that, for example, Hollywood tells. These are stories that are used, or narratives that are used for strategic reasons in an increasingly tight kind of global power landscape.
So Folashadé Soulé helped to organize this. She served as the convener, and she wrote an introduction to the report. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today, but she did send us a few thoughts that will be a useful exercise for us to kick off our discussion. And she answers the question about why it's important to focus on narratives in the Africa-China relationship. And let's take a listen to what she had to say.
The analysis of Africa-China relations is subject to increased polarization between, on the one hand, the good China in Africa discourse versus the bad China in Africa discourse. And in this polarized space, there's not much left for nuanced perspectives. It is important to focus on the duality of these narratives and interrogate their diffusion in order to better understand the process of their construction, but also, especially as analysts of Africa-China relations, to deconstruct them. And the collection hence asks how these narratives emanate, meaning who are the actors that construct these narratives? Is it mainly a high-level elite project? What is the audience for these narratives, and what is the purpose that it serves? How are these narratives pushed in the public debate?
Lina, this is a topic that you focused on in your work over the years. Can you answer some of the questions that Folashadé raised in terms of what are these narratives, how are they pushed, and who is pushing them?
Absolutely. So I think narratives, just as Cobus said, they are a way to make sense of the world. They are discourses, they are stories that we tell about the world we live in, that we tell about, but they are also, narratives are also full of power, right? The certain narratives see the day of light, so they become normalized, they become things we take for granted, they become common sense. And other narratives we don't hear about, and they go under the radar. And I think the difference here is definitely there's a power differential that comes sometimes from material aspects of power. So projects that get a lot of financing, for instance, they get to have a narrative about what those projects are. So I think here, going back to what Folashadé was saying, there is in common, maybe media representations of China-Africa, especially from my side, when I see how China-Africa relations are talked about in policy circles in the US and sometimes as well in media reports, there is a narrative, right, that suggests and favors a view that China is exercising almost kind of a neo-colonial type of relationship with Africans. And the narrative we don't hear almost at all about is the African side, right? So we almost never hear what Africans themselves think about what China is doing. And that's one of the questions or issues that we were trying to respond to in this workshop and through this report, is to explore narratives from the African side. And it's something that I wrote about in the piece. And one of the main arguments that I make in that piece is that when we look at surveys by the Afrobarometer, which I use in the piece, we see that Africans actually do not see that China and the US, for example, sit in a zero-sum game kind of relationship. They don't see that if an African state chooses, or an African even respondent to these surveys thinks that China provides a good development model, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are pro-authoritarianism or that they are pro or anti-democratic norms or that they are anti-US. What I tried to show in the piece, that these things are so much more complicated than simplistic generalizations and simplistic narratives, that if an African state favors China, it means the US is lost. Or if an African state or an African respondent thinks highly or positively of China, then there's democratic backsliding, other than that there is a narrative about how Africa or the West has lost Africa to China. So none of these things actually show on the ground when we do more granular analysis of what Africans actually think about these relationships.
Yunnan, when we hear Lina talk about the durability of some of these narratives that have shaped the Western thinking, and in many cases, again, the Chinese thinking as well, about Africa, we don't hear the African responses as prominently. But I think it also might be worthwhile, before we go forward a lot more, to talk about what are some of the prevailing narratives that are shaping how people think about the Africa-China relationship. You're in London. In Europe, they have sometimes some very similar views of what Chinese engagement is in Africa to those here in the United States, that it's generally, the word is malign. It is a neo-colonial type of experience. Can you talk a little bit about some of the narratives that Lina's touched on, but give us a couple of examples that have been used to shape and frame this relationship over the past 20 years?
Sure. And then I think, coming from a London-based and more European perspective, it's important to note just how much these are also being shaped by the very geopoliticized and increasingly geopolitical narratives that are coming out of Washington and coming from the US. In terms of how China's intentions and practices are perceived in Africa, I think it's certainly fair to say that they're generally quite negatively viewed. And we see this most prominently when it comes to areas around finance in debt relations and in the way that Chinese projects, Chinese development cooperation operates on the ground, in the way that projects and construction of infrastructure operates. The most prevalent meme or narrative that has been popularized in the recent years is that of the debt trap narrative. And this is something I touch on in my piece and also in Cobus's piece in the anthology. This label came out of a single case that was widely debunked in scholarly circles. This, of course, is the Hanbantota port case in Sri Lanka. But it's remained a very enduring idea of how Chinese finance and how Chinese debt finance operates, in that it's something that impacts African states negatively. They are put in a position where they're unable to repay these debts and they suffer for it, and that when processes of debt restructuring, as we've seen in Zambia, China behaves as not a team player at the table. That China pushes back very strongly against these established norms that came out of this post-war Bretton Woods order, that was this group of rich industrialized states that established norms around Paris Club, the Bretton Woods institutions, and these ideas of global order. China very much challenges these ideas through their practices.
And that notion of the debt trap, and we're going to get to that because Cobus and you both wrote about it, but has been deeply internalized in Africa as well. If you recall, several years ago, there was the instance of the Entebbe airport that the Monitor newspaper in Uganda said was going to be repossessed by the Chinese. There was the port of Mombasa, that there was concerns that came out that the Chinese were going to seize the port for the failing to pay back Chinese debts. In Zambia, there were reports that ZNBC, the television network, was going to be seized by the Chinese in lieu of debts. And of course, in Nigeria, there was a lot of talk about the loss of sovereignty to Chinese loans, and this was related to the sovereign immunity clauses in some of the contracts. And so there was this debt trap narrative is very prominent in African media discourses as well. Yu-Shan, that brings us up into the question of the African response. And I want to go back to Folashadé, and I'd like you to respond to what she talks about, and she raises the question of what options do Africans have in order to counter some of these narratives coming from the global North, and again, shaping so much of the Africa-China relationship. Let's listen again to Folashadé Soulé.
Beyond focusing on narratives as sites of power competition, it is equally important to interrogate the rise of alternative and counter-narratives emerging from the global South, but also the question of policy space. What are Africa's policy space and policy options in this context of global rivalries? Beyond countering these narratives, the emergence of alternative narratives emanating from the global South could be, in my opinion, the solution for more autonomy and so-called non-alignment, in the sense of carving an autonomous foreign policy despite the very asymmetrical nature of the relationship with China.
Yu-Shan, you're in Johannesburg. You've been studying these issues for a very long time. Folashadé talks about the asymmetric relationship that does impact this. Again, how can African stakeholders respond?
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here with all of you again. I was at the conference of last year and to join Eric and Cobus again. How can Africans respond? I think it's quite interesting what Folashadé mentioned, just to say that since the beginning of this discussion, it reminded me of this New Yorker opinion piece that I came across, where the writer talked about this increasing importance of narratives. And yes, we talk about it in the policy space, but also this idea that narratives have become more persuasive than statistics, or the fact that, we remember stories more than fact. What is quite interesting is biologically, there's also this connection to, connection or stories also create a form of hormonal release. So I just found that quite interesting, just to re-highlight the importance of narratives. I think it's important, yes, to have these alternative perspectives. I think is this idea, there's two sets of narratives coming through at the moment. One, we have this great power rivalry, which we all have mentioned and looked at. And on the other hand is, of course, this increase in talk about multipolarity, these minilateral alternatives such as BRICS and other sorts of platforms. And you kind of see these two narratives playing out. I think it is important, of course, to have the challenge to the great power rivalry kind of narratives, but we also have to interrogate then what the alternatives are. We talk about the BRICS, we talk about multipolarity, where countries such as India or Brazil might talk more about strategic autonomy or strategic non-alignment. But the question here is, where is power situated? Because what often gets overlooked in these situations is also, the very real hierarchies that exist within the global south. So, yeah, I think it's important, as much as we see these alternative perspectives come out, is how much of it is, also coming from the continent.
Yeah, Cobus, one of the things that you've picked up during our discussions here in Washington is how oftentimes when people talk about the China-Africa relationship and China-Global South relationship more broadly, it's very reductive. And we heard it yesterday in one of our discussions where there's this implicit assumption that the United States is benevolent, Europe is benevolent, Africa is the victim, and China is malign. And that word malign is used a lot in Washington. And these are these very simple binary narratives. And we heard it even a couple of weeks ago at a Carnegie Endowment event here in Washington, where they brought together a number of assistant secretaries of state. That's the top diplomat in the United States for different regions. And they brought together former assistant secretaries of state for Africa. And Johnny Carson, who was the assistant secretary of state, I think under the Clinton administration, again, wagged his finger to the audience and said, basically, choose us because we are the better and China doesn't have your best interests at heart. That's a very crude summary of it. But this binary reductive way of looking at it is very prominent here in Washington, Cobus.
Very much. And the problem with that, of course, is that it tends to completely flatten African complexities. And we all know how very complex Africa is. But also, it tends to draw attention away and energy away from engaging with African priorities. And we're seeing this very much around narratives, around critical minerals, for example, at the moment, where there's a lot of energy, and this comes up a lot in these discussions, a lot of energy both in Europe and in the United States around access to critical minerals and around, shielding themselves from Chinese influence and, in these critical mineral supply chains. And then the discussion about the African side of that may include, some general broad kind of narratives of like, oh yes, we need to use critical minerals to fuel African industrialization. And, Africa's the future, it's the youngest continent and so on, like these kind of platitudes, but very little oxygen and attention paid to what actual African priorities are, or like, where the African Union's critical minerals strategy is right now and how the industrialization will exactly work and et cetera, right? There's not a lot of space there to talk about African priorities for these very important resources. And that, tendency ends up being replicated, in many other aspects of the debate as well, where Africa is this kind of weird situation where Africa is kind of in the room being talked about, but not really being talked with.
Yeah, and Lina, you wrote in your report, and let me just quote from it here, binary interpretations of U.S.-China rivalry in Africa leave very little room for nuance or for Africans to be included as agents representing their sovereign interests. So you're saying a lot of what Cobus is saying is that the flattening of the African side, and you contend forcefully that this is 100% counterproductive.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree, because I think what these binary narratives, they are, as you said, they're reductive. They do not allow for any complexity in the relationship. And what they also do is they put a common sense narrative or a taken for granted narrative that the US-led global order is a rules-based order. And you almost cannot contend that following rules and rules-based order is something good, right? So there's an association with everything that the US does is supposed to be rules-based. And by definition, that leaves out everything that China does is not rules-based, right? It's not following the rule of law. It's not following these norms of transparency, basically all kinds of positive norms that the US in its narrative attaches its own behavior in Africa to. And I think that this is what's problematic about these binary narratives. They do not allow for us to question and to look at some of these, nuance. And kind of what Folashadé says as well, there is an asymmetry, right? We cannot not see the asymmetry that exists between China and African states. And we're not saying that there isn't any asymmetry. But the problem is when we lump all that China does in Africa under this narrative of danger, of threat, of alarmism, we're not doing any favor to anybody, right? Because even US foreign policymakers would be well-to-do to understand really what works in China's model, because other states have been doing the same thing. They've been actually looking at China and trying to see what works. So Japan has been doing that as well as of late. There's also an arrogance that comes with these binary narratives. There's a patronization as well, because it's just saying we know what's good for Africans, we can judge what is good, and we can tell you how to basically run your relationships with partners, whether China or others. I think that these are the problems with these binary narratives, that they come with a silencing of the African side when they are supposed to be providing this better solution or this better way or this better, but they're just doing that so far, mostly rhetorically, and we're not necessarily seeing a lot of it that's constructive in a way that's helping or that's providing a better initiative. To go back to also what Yu-Shan was saying, there are really some real hierarchies within the Global South, and there are power differentials within the Global South. And so we're not necessarily saying that we should just kind of blindly or naively accept that anything that's coming from the Global South has to necessarily be better for Africans or for others in the Global South. But the overall image, the overall picture of having more players is one that suggests that there are more options, that it opens up alternatives, it opens up a bit more room to breathe in a way. And I think that that's what we are celebrating in a sense, right? It's not necessarily kind of a 100% or naive, kind of pro-China stance, but it's a pro-more options stance.
Yunnan, we've been talking a lot about this from the point of view of Europe and the US towards Africa in terms of flattening the relationship and these reductive narratives. But the same could be said when you look at it from the point of view of China towards Africa as well. There's a lot of this reductive binary framing that's also prevalent in the Chinese discourse about Africa, particularly now in this era of great power competition. Can you speak to a little bit of that in terms of how does it seem from China looking towards Africa?
I think China also similarly sees itself as the good guy, right? China frames its development cooperation as a developing country. It's been very resistant to joining the rich world club of the OECD DAC and taking on this mantle of being a donor. It still sees itself as global South country, providing South-South cooperation and bringing its own experience and its own domestic sort of proven experience of having gone through this economic boom as a kind of marker of legitimacy when it's going out and engaging with other developing countries. And the Belt and Road Initiative and the way that the Belt and Road Initiative has been framed, I think, is one of the sort of flagship representations of that narrative. But I think it's important to discuss narratives as dynamic, right? They're not one-sided, they're not broadcast, but they're also received, interpreted, and also leveraged by other actors. And when we talk about the BRI and the way in which China engages in developing countries, a lot of that is framed through this idea of infrastructure and modernization. And that's actually been something that's been very compelling for African governments and African states. In my piece, I draw on several examples of massive railway projects, for example, which have been quite criticized and problematic in many nuanced ways. But when you see the ways in which these infrastructure projects have been demanded and also leveraged by African sovereigns, they represent also narratives of development, of modernization that have been used to provide political legitimacy to African governments. And going back to the great power politics that we've been discussing as well, I think it's also quite ironic that despite the BRI having attracted all of this criticism of being debt traps, of indebting global south countries and for ignoring norms around ESG, transparency, etc., the US and Europe are now basically deploying their own versions of this, having basically retreated from the infrastructure sector and the idea of infrastructure as development for many decades. They are now plowing headfirst into huge mega projects, into supporting infrastructure development, particularly in connectivity sectors, under the banner of the G7 PGII and the EU's Global Gateway. And so I think it's important, as Lina said, that maybe there are some lessons to be drawn from the BRI and in drawing from the experiences of the challenges of supporting infrastructure and developmental objectives on the ground, instead of just going forward and assuming that everything you do is better.
Yu-Shan, I'd like to stay in Asia in terms of the perspective of looking at this from Asia towards Africa. You wrote in your part of the report what the Indo-Pacific narrative tells us about China and Africa. And that's a link that a lot of people don't make very often. What is the link between Asia-Pacific, or Indo-Pacific as they like to say here, and the China-Africa relationship?
Yeah, I think part of this was the fact that I am part of the Ocean Regions program, and we're increasingly looking at the oceans. I mean, I think a lot of the work, including in Africa-China studies, focuses on territory, except the fact that 70% of the Earth's surface is water. And we need to start thinking about this precisely because I think our view of what regions are have traditionally been quite territory-based. And increasingly, through concepts like the Indo-Pacific, this view is moving towards oceans. So the Indo-Pacific is this idea that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean have become one mega region. And I mean, this is not something new, a concept that's been around since the 1940s and again in the marine biology world. But I think its current iteration is interesting because there is a much larger geopolitical slant towards us. Versus if we think about the Asia-Pacific, which is, I think, the connotation of the Asia-Pacific was more to do with economic integration. So this is this idea that power has shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the recognition that I think 3 of the 4 largest economies outside of Europe, which is India, Japan, and China, are situated here. So I think it's significant, one, because we know that the Quad members, the US, Japan, India, and Australia, have all, I think, supported the idea of the Indo-Pacific. It has in a large way been appropriated by the US since Trump in around 2017 and then under Biden. But I think what is interesting when it comes to narratives is in my piece, I show how from 2021 to 2022, 8 new policy positions or strategies or outlooks were published around the Indo-Pacific. And what is interesting is I think that we take policy documents or country positions as fact. They're written and they also include narratives and perspectives. They become fact. And because the Indo-Pacific is such an evolving concept and it's still changing, these policy positions then become what an Australian scholar, Rory Metcalf, calls mental maps. They end up creating what the geography of the Indo-Pacific is. And how this links then to China and Africa in 2 kind of ways. One is that China is a large emphasis in a lot of these positions or strategies and is identified as a challenge. And Africa is interesting because it isn't actually evenly accounted for in these strategies. So what is fascinating is the US, which is the Western outpost of the Indo-Pacific, is very much seen as central to the Indo-Pacific idea, whereas Africa, which is the Western Indo-Pacific and its littoral states and island states, hardly feature in many of these views towards the Indo-Pacific. I think amongst the Quad, only Japan and India have originally viewed African countries as part of their view of this mega region. So it then leaves the question, how does Africa feature and why does it not? And I think one reason is that a lot of these positions tend to emphasize the tensions in the Pacific, which are more traditional security issues and they give less emphasis to issues in the Indian Ocean, which are much more to do with non-traditional security, such as climate change, piracy, and overfishing.
And you're suggesting that we focus more on the Africa side of the Indo-Pacific question, which often gets overlooked.
Yes, so I do suggest that we have to include Africa in this. And like the others, I also mentioned China's BRI then as another perspective that overlays this mega region. Because I think, as Yunnan had mentioned before, I think the BRI in its own way and narrative is quite compelling for African audiences. And I think there are lessons for Indo-Pacific positions as well, because the BRI has been quite compelling in terms of it hasn't been completely institutionalized, but it's institutionalized to the point where there is a regular forum taking place, MOUs have been signed. China always provides this view that, it's not going to pull out in its partnership to Africa. And also, I think it's been quite smart in creating co-constituted narratives. So we have the BRI, but if you look at a lot of the FOCAC documentation from 2015 to 2018, they hardly mentioned the BRI. They talked about Agenda 2063, which in qualitative terms are very similar to what the BRI focuses on. Yet they focused more on, I think, African-led narratives to mean the same thing. And you see China doing this even in the Indo-Pacific, where it may not formally agree or subscribe to the idea of the Indo-Pacific because it is viewed as a way to manage and counter China, but it has on occasion said that it supports certain positions, such as ASEAN's position towards the Indo-Pacific. And almost in that way, you can co-constitute something that is still evolving.
Okay, I'd like to wrap up our discussion with some reflections from you all, because you have all been in this space for a very long time. We've known you for more than 10 years of studying this, and some of you have been doing it for longer. You're all advocating for a more nuanced understanding, less binary, less reductive understanding of the Africa-China relationship, paying much more attention to African agency in all of this, and resisting some of the traditional, very durable stories, narratives, framings that come typically out of the United States and Europe, but also, to be fair, out of China as well. I'd like to just go around each of you to give some final thoughts on where you think the narratives are and where do you think they're going. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting better at this. You are advocating for it to get better, but I haven't seen a lot of improvement for the most part, but I'd like to get your take on this. Cobus, let's start with you. Again, final thoughts, wrapping up what we've talked about today, the report, and where you see the discussion about China-Africa going.
For me, I think we tend to think of the field as being about Africa-China relations. But as you were saying, one of the kind of obviously key stakeholders, but also a key narrative flow in the entire way we understand the relationship as a whole is the West and Western power. And I think we're in a moment where Western narratives are really up in the air. They're really changing very rapidly. And I think some of them are fracturing very rapidly because of real world events. Again, like as I say, like for example, the US framing of itself as a promoter of democracy and a promoter of human rights is, that has always been a complicated narrative. Like at any time, kind of since, say, over the last 150 years, that would have been a complicated narrative once one gets into the weeds of the details of which particular democracies were promoted and which not. But I think at the moment, after January 6th, the insurrection on January 6th, and after the Gaza crisis, I think some of these narratives are really coming up for very significant challenge. And it's also a moment, I think, where kind of also not only in the United States, but also in Europe, there's, the extreme polarization, left-right polarization in many European democracies, and the very rapid rise of extreme right-wing kind of power in Europe. All of these factors, they feel sometimes a little bit like that there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance creeping in between the narratives that one hears from high-level stakeholders from Western countries and some of the actual events within those Western countries and, and adjacent to them. So that ends up then reshaping a lot of the kind of assumptions that underlie some of the Africa-China narratives as well, particularly as they come from Western power. And kind of, I think some of the kind of splits between some global South actors and some global North actors, for example, South Africa's very kind of like, fraught position in relation to the Gaza crisis has started to expose some of these cracks. And I think it's going to be really important to track how the narratives then adapt to these changes.
Lina, let's get your final thoughts. What do you recommend for people to do in order to better understand this complex relationship and resist the binary narratives that you wrote about?
I agree with Cobus in saying that it's important to realize that when we speak about Africa-China, we're speaking about much more than a continent and a country relationship. We need to contextualize. We need to bring in multipolarity. We need to bring in the many actors and players and stakeholders and partners that are involved in the conversation. We cannot just isolate this to speak just about Africa-China, but it needs to be broadened and needs to be contextualized in multipolar world order that we are living in at the moment. I also think that in terms of recommendations or in terms of just even what I think the direction of the narratives in the near future, I would say I am a bit an optimist when it comes to this, because we are seeing a lot more vocal research studies centers, think tanks, scholars coming out of the continent owning and taking ownership of these narratives and producing research clusters and reports and so on and so forth to put forward. Even when we think about the Afrobarometer, I mean, there's just the amount of data, the amount of work that it does to bring the African voices to the global stage is extremely important. And I think that we are seeing more and more of this ownership being taken by African stakeholders. And I think that this is one way to make sure that Africans are not left behind when these discussions between these big powers and these rivalries, the geopolitical rivalries, then typically we see kind of a retrenchment or a retraction, right, from the side of the African. And this is, I think, a good sign to see the amount of rising scholars, students, think tanks, groups across the continent that are participating in the production of knowledge about Africa-China relationship, but also really about the position of Africa in the world and looking at the world from Africa. So I think that these are signs that suggest there is a little bit more eagerness and willingness to take part of these conversations now. I mean, obviously, Africans can't really change politics in the US, and we know that this is an election year and that these narratives, we have been used to this now in the US, where even when the two parties agree on nothing, they typically agree on bashing China, they typically agree on kind of painting China with this negative brush, and that has repercussions on the global South in general and Africa in particular. And this being an elections year, just as Cobus was saying earlier, it just really does suggest that we are in a limbo kind of moment, waiting to see what goes on in U.S. politics that might have an influence on the way that the U.S. would look at Africa. But the last 4 years of the U.S. kind of Biden administration, 3 years really, and the U.S. Africa policy has a little bit shifted towards at least toning down that sort of arrogant, patronizing narratives towards Africans and what Africa-China relationship means. And if this keeps going, potentially we might see, maybe, if one is a hyper-optimist, a place where we value nuance, where we value bringing Africans into the discussion and bringing African perspectives more into understanding really what Africans see in the Africa-China relationship.
Yu-Shan, Lina's optimistic, which is always encouraging. How do you feel?
So I'm going to first give you a quote that I had used when we were in the panel last year, which I really resonated with, by Leo Tolstoy, where he said that there's only two storylines that matter. One is that a hero goes on a journey, and the second is that a stranger comes to town. It's very much about perspective. And I think that when we're looking at these binary narratives, what Lina says about contextualizing is so important, because I think the more that you contextualize these very different or seemingly polar opposite narratives, the more they start to look the same. So it's all about contextualization. That's what I would That would be my suggestion. In the space of the Indo-Pacific and the oceans, though, there is a gap when it comes to African narratives. As of the middle of 2023, there has been no national or regional community or joint continental position towards something like the Indo-Pacific. So that is still missing, I think, on the African side. There have only been some forms of statement from Kenya, for example. So that's the other thing. And then on the third, I think we didn't manage to touch on this, but I think Lina as well as Yunnan mentioned it in their pieces, is this idea that as much as we talk about narratives, what are the perspectives towards, China and the US? They try so hard to put across certain narratives, but in the end, perceptions towards them come out same. There was a Rand Corp, I think, survey that correlates with the Afrobarometer survey, where they surveyed Indo-Pacific countries, selected Indo-Pacific countries, and they found that the US and China came almost tie in terms of perceptions towards them, only that China is viewed more positively in terms of economic development and the US in terms of military and diplomacy. And as we know, the FOCAC is coming up, I think, later this year in September. It would be interesting, I think, for me to see how China can continue in the context of what Yunnan's talked about on this, economic development trajectory, and also continue to emphasize that there is no geopolitical intent. Because what it does with the BRI compared to the Indo-Pacific is it downplays the Pacific Ocean tensions and divorces that from the Indian Ocean. Thank you very much.
Yunnan, we're going to give you the last word. What do you want people to take away from the report that you collectively wrote and from our discussion today?
I think I'm going to echo my collaborators, my dear colleagues here, in emphasizing this need for greater attention and need for greater nuance. Greater attention to perspectives from the African continent, which of course are heterogeneous, and even within countries there's a distinction between attitudes to China from popular civil society and attitudes from the elite. And I think from the elite side, African sovereigns who have their own political or economic objectives for their countries perhaps see China in a more pragmatic way that the West could do better to recognize. China doesn't pretend to be an altruistic donor, is very clear in how it presents itself as self-interested, but in some ways it feels less hypocritical, right, than the way in which perhaps European donors behave, and bringing in their own principles and norms as part of that development cooperation, which comes off a lot more conditional. In terms of my thoughts on where certain narratives are going and the narratives that I'm paying attention to, I think it's been quite positive to see how this grand Uber narrative of the BRI has really brought about a cascade of attention towards the importance of connectivity, of infrastructure, and of economic development from the other major powers, and this recognition of the importance of growth and development in the African continent. But going forward, I think we're also entering a strange new era of what I might call small China, or a smaller China, where China's own very well recognized economic challenges, decline in its own domestic economic growth, and its very marked decline in overseas finance raises some quite existential questions of what kind of a role China will play in the continent going forward, which has previously been defined by large sums of capital, a lot of resources, a lot of financial commitments. And in an era where it may not be able to do that anymore, I think that relationship is going to see some interesting shift.
The report is exploring the role of narratives in China-Africa relations. It's absolutely essential reading for anybody who wants to understand where this relationship is going and what we can do to resist some of the more destructive aspects of framing this relationship in very flat ways or reductive binary ways, as we've heard. I want to thank Folashadé Soulé for bringing everybody together to write the report and also for her contributions to the show today. Lina, Yunnan, Yu-Shan, thank you all for joining us and for your fascinating insights today. It was wonderful to have the chance to speak with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cobus, this was an absolutely fascinating discussion. The work that you all did on this report, very timely. And I think you can see the need for this type of research and these articles to come out, given the fact that here in Washington, in many of the discussions, we're having the same conversations today that we've had 4, 5, even 10 years ago. So there is a real need to try and push this idea of a more complex relationship in the Africa-China dynamic. That being said, all of you are scholars and academics. As you guys were all talking, I was trying to think of it from my point of view in terms of a layperson. Okay, somebody says, I buy the argument, Cobus. I need a better understanding, a more nuanced, more textured understanding of the Africa-China relationship. What do you do about it? How do people go about getting a more textured, nuanced understanding if they're sitting in Bonn or they're sitting in New York or they're sitting in Beijing, far away from places like Johannesburg or academic conferences that people like you go to?
I think they start tracking more of the writing that is coming out of African research institutions and think tanks, and there's more and more of them that focus on China.
Can you be specific here? Like where? Like what? I want to try and be as practical as possible here so people listening to this can say, oh, let me go and look that up.
More and more research centers are emerging, focusing not only on Africa-China relations, but also on Africa's relations with other emerging powers. So, for example, institutions like the Afro-Sino Center for International Relations, for example, and the Center for the Global South, for example, in Morocco, they do really valuable work, I think, on all of these issues. But I think also the polling data that specifically Lina and Yu-Shan were speaking about is also that it provides a much more kind of fine-grained glimpse of what public opinion in Africa looks like in relation to China, but also specifically it gives you a more of a glimpse of how China is positioned among other actors. So for example, some of the Afrobarometer surveys are fascinating. For example, putting countries like the US and China are, kind of in the same poll as, for example, UN agencies. And through that, you get a kind of a glimpse of what the respondents' lives are like. Kind of if you have, for example, how much healthcare are they getting from USAID versus from the UN, for example. So those start giving you a real kind of like more concrete idea of what the lives are that sit behind all of this data. And then I think also actually African social media is actually very useful. I mean, it's messy sometimes, definitely, but kind of like particularly when there's like around the time of FOCAC, for example, like Africa Twitter is a very, very valuable resource to start getting your head around the complexity of African responses to China and to the West.
Again, I want to bring up this issue of flipping it, where we've talked again about the US and Europe engaging and trafficking in these very reductive, simple narratives, which I think is well documented and still continues to this day. But I don't want to let China off the hook either in the Chinese media. So much of what they're framing is also in, again, equally reductive binary ways. Win-win relationship, everything's fine. Any criticism of what the Chinese are doing in Africa is because Western forces want to drive a wedge. Again, you see these very, very just base types of arguments. And in many ways, there is a paternalism that also exists in the Chinese narratives, and particularly in the media narratives that come out about Africa. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I mean, this is why narrative is so important. It's not just about Western narratives. The entire space, the Africa-China relationship, is such a huge relationship that narrative is one of the tools to kind of try and kind of get a handle on it and to try and make it understandable. And Chinese narratives are key to this, and they are in many cases extremely problematic. The issue isn't particularly necessarily just being like, oh, this narrative is problematic and that one is problematic. It's more a situation of what is being left out. Like, narrative is a way of understanding the world, but it makes the world understandable by leaving out most of the reality, and focusing on a few points which it then connects, in order to make them understandable. So each narrative is necessarily excludes, by necessity, almost all of the reality it talks about. And so, the exclusions in strategic narratives specifically are very intentional, and they're also very consequential. What is not being talked about falls off the table. And so, so for example, like, if one dives into Chinese state media, you will get a very strong impression, for example, of China's role in pushing infrastructure. And I mean, one could raise all kind of problems around that, but that is very much center of the agenda. Much less so is, for example, China's role in deforestation because of illegal timber trade. That's not coming up in the Chinese media narrative, but that's still a part of the story. So, the complexity of it has to, you only get complexity by firstly mixing narratives and pulling in as many narratives as you can from as many actors as you can, but also then questioning them and being like, what is not being said here?
Yeah. And again, that is so relevant to the discussions we're having here in Washington. We're going to be joined next week by our Africa editor, Geronima, to reflect on the 2 weeks of field research that we've been doing here, talking to everybody, having these discussions. Maybe you can just share a few thoughts about what you're telling. We've talked about what we've heard, but what are you saying back to the scholars, analysts, policymakers, lawmakers that we're meeting with here in Washington as a little bit of a preview of what we're going to talk about next week?
Well, I mostly want to listen. I really, really want to hear what people are saying.
But people do want to hear what you have to say. They do ask you.
They force me to say things.
Yes, they do. So, listening is important, but also, having a dialogue is equally important.
Overall, one of the big things that I keep repeating is the importance of really taking African priorities seriously. And with that, these aren't just priorities that one would hear from one-on-one discussions with African policymakers. These are planning kind of policies and documents and strategies that are being produced by the African Union, by the African Development Bank, by other large African stakeholders that set a very clear agenda about what Africa wants to get done. That, I think, is really important. The other issue, I think, is to avoid, the recommendation I frequently make is to avoid tunnel vision. What one finds frequently in think tank spaces is there's a vogue for a specific issue. And, one of the vogues at the moment is a very strong tunnel vision focus on Russia's position in Africa. And at the same time, a very significant, possibly even more significant kind of emerging role play in Africa, like the United Arab Emirates, for example, is almost completely ignored. We're talking, one of these kind of urban narratives that Yunnan was referring to is that we're living through at the moment is the rise of multipolarity. And what multipolarity is actually going to mean on the ground, what it's going to mean for Iran to be more of a factor in African politics, for example, that it's discussed. Of course, there's this amazing specialist working on these issues, in DC and more than many other cities, but that's not necessarily part of the narratives that we're hearing. So making the narratives be more coherent with some of what we're seeing on the ground, I think that is one of the points that I keep trying to raise.
Well, we'll deep dive into this again next week when Jiro joins us. It's going to be a fascinating discussion because it's been a fascinating week so far. We've got one more to go, and we just love the chance to speak with everybody. We want to really give a shout out to all of the listeners of the show who we've met and have been so kind in welcoming us. And it's just been a really fun opportunity to meet so many followers who've been listening to us, you and I, they say back sometimes 12, 13 years now. And that's really very exciting for us. So let's leave the conversation there. Again, if you'd like to follow all of the work that we're doing in these issues and challenging the narratives, that is exactly what we do at the China Global South Project and what we've been doing for 15 years on this program. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Your subscription helps to support the work that we do. It also helps to put out, again, content and research and analysis that amplifies African voices and Global South voices in this discourse, specifically to achieve the goal of what all of the scholars today on the show said, which is to push back against these binary reductive narratives that are so counterproductive and even toxic in many respects because they lead you down the wrong path into what is a very complex, dynamic relationship. Once again, ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. If you are a student or a teacher, just email me, Eric, ERIC, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you a link to half off subscriptions, just $10 a month. And being back here in the United States, Cobus, $10 is, you don't walk out of Starbucks for less than $10 these days. So it's a very good deal to get a subscription to the China Global South Project. Once again, thank you, Cobus, and thanks to all of our scholars who joined us today. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus van Staden, I'm Eric Olander, both of us today in Washington. We'll talk to you again very soon. Thanks for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.